contrast, the average experience, say that, you would have with the VA versus going to, say, one of these community care
Right.
providers,
Right.
like what you do.
Right. So specifically, like I'd like to discuss when it comes to what's called RRTP, Residential Rehabilitation Treatment Programs, right? Which is what we are. My company, Miramar, is a community care provider. Now, when you think about VA healthcare, right, and like what the needs are, you don't necessarily think about what is their dermatology program like? What is their orthopedics like, right? And those are all good programs. And I can't speak to much of those or anything like that. But the biggest threat right now to veterans is suicide addiction, right? And those and mental health, suicide addiction, and Venn diagram, they all overlap, right? And so the VA is often overloaded as far as capacity goes, capability depends where they are, and they know that. So then when President Trump signed the Mission Act into law, that was meant to give them choice. Now, go back to like high school civics class, right? Or like Schoolhouse Rock, about how bill becomes law, right? Mission Act gets passed, right? And then the relevant agencies, in this case, the Department of Veterans Affairs, takes the law, and then they've got a battalion of lawyers, right, who interpret that law and create policy to enforce that law. Well, you may or may not know this, but any agency has a little bit of leeway, right? There's some artistic license that can be taken when it comes to turning this law into policy, into action. So what VA determined under previous administrations, right, is that, veteran choice for community care and standards to access to care doesn't really apply to mental health and addiction. There's different standards now, and that's not really written in the law, but that's just how it turned out. So what is really unfortunate and has been happening for a long time is the veterans who either want care in the community because either out of their own choice or out of the VA has a waiting list, they should be able to get access to that community care right away. Instead, now again, your mileage may vary depending on the VA you're working at, but I'm speaking for Southern California, right, where there's about 5 or 6 different VA hospitals we work with: Los Angeles, San Diego, Long Beach, Loma Linda, San Francisco. We also deal with them sometimes, Fresno. They have a policy now, which is not in line with President Trump's guidance, not in line with Secretary Collins' guidance, that says we don't do community care, or we will only refer out to community care if there is a waiting list to enter a VA facility that is longer than 30 days. Now, I'm sure that many people listening to this, and you and other people around here, know someone who's been in an addiction or mental health crisis. When they are in need of help, they don't have 30 days. They don't often have 30 hours, really, because somebody needs to grab them by the collar. Like, okay, when they say, hey, I need help, I'm ready. You grab them by the collar, get in the car, get on the plane, we're going now. That has to happen because the whole idea is to get them off the X, as you'd say, like in a combat situation, you gotta get off the X, get them somewhere. So this is something that I've been lobbying for because I spent time here in DC when I was in the military. I had friends who worked here, friends who worked on the Hill, and I identified this problem 3 years ago, right? And I'm like, what the hell? Why is the VA not following the Mission Act, right? At least the ones we're working with. And I know you've had Darren Selnick on here talking about the VA stuff, and he has been, that man is a patriot, and that guy is doing everything for the veterans. I love that man, right? And I've been working with him a lot. And I testified 2 years ago before House Veterans Affairs Committee on this, where we're just trying to enable choice for veterans or at least access. The whole idea that I've been begging for a long time is say, hey, veteran's in crisis, veteran needs help. He calls his VA provider and says, hey, I need help. The last thing he needs to hear is, oh, okay, well, we can get you an assessment sometime next week. And then there's a waiting list. We'll get you into a domiciliary, which is, the VA's own facility. We'll get you in a treatment program in the next 2-3 weeks or so. In the meantime, you can take an online Zoom, outpatient course, or maybe come to outpatient. When these guys are in the throes of withdrawal, right? And just like you had Adam on here last week talking about addiction cases and all that. When somebody's going through an opioid withdrawal, they need help right away. Or they're or they're suicidal, or they're already struggling with alcohol, they're struggling with homelessness. They need help right away. And the VA would deny community care, or just as a matter of policy, would deny community care to veterans. And even when there's a bed available, we'll take him right now. There are cases where a veteran comes and needs help, and there's a bed, we can have them in our care before lunch. And the VA just won't. And this is not the fault of the social workers on the ground, the nurse, the doctor. It's not them. It's a policy issue. So there's a big, strong disconnect between what VA central office here in DC wants and says. And as that trickles down through the bureaucratic process, that deep state aspect of this giant bureaucracy down to the VISN, like the district, the region, and then down to the hospitals, and the policy gets implemented. That's a huge problem. And the thing is, there's probably hundreds of veterans, maybe nationwide thousands, I'm sure, that have died because they don't have access to care. And one of the things that there's currently a bill that's in Congress right now, haven't checked the status of it recently. They're trying to get it signed by Veterans Day, called the Access Act. And what that will do is that will immediately change those access standards to where a veteran needs help for mental health or addiction, they immediately can get choice and then go. And so that's a huge deal. However, the VA has the executive authority to do that immediately. And it hasn't happened yet. And I feel that this might be a missed opportunity for the administration, right? Because there are bureaucrats within the VA at the upper levels and at the middle levels that are dishonoring President Trump 45 during his first term. They're dishonoring his legacy from the Mission Act. They really are.
Yeah.
And a big part of this issue is that the VA currently does not have any political appointees in the Veterans Healthcare Administration, which is the largest part of VA by far, right? And I believe that there are certain people within the VA, I can't really name names. It's kind of like this nameless, faceless, the system, right? That are very anti-community care. And it's gotten so bad, and believe it or not, I hate to say this, but the status of community care was actually better under the Biden administration than it is now. That is not the fault of Secretary Collins or from President Trump, but that is elements within the VA that do not like community care for a number of reasons. And I mean, even most recently, right, very recently, the VA Office Inspector General, right, put out a statement saying there's concerns about the quality of care coming from community care providers. I believe that's a smokescreen. And I can tell you why, because the main reason is because, well, we don't sure about what kind of quality care these community care providers have. Well, the thing is, though, is like you cannot be a community care provider unless you are licensed by the state and accredited by the Joint Commission or CARF, which are the major accrediting bodies, which is good enough for anyone who has a very high dollar Cadillac private insurance policy. If it's good enough for the high dollar, very wealthy, well-insured people, it's probably good enough for the veterans, for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And here's a key point that also I think is really important. And, Secretary Collins, if you're listening, please understand this point. If there is a non-veteran who just has the most basic, bare bones insurance policy that meets the Affordable Care Act standard, right? We all require to have health insurance, et cetera. Anyone, right, who has just basic health insurance and they are in an addiction crisis or a mental health crisis, they can walk into any, mental health facility, residential treatment program, drug treatment facility, and like, let's say it's Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, let's say, right? They can knock on the door. They could literally, they don't have to call. They could just walk in if they wanted to and say, hi, I need help. Will you please admit me? And they diagnose them. Yes, you're in an addiction crisis. Okay. They verify your insurance. Welcome. Take a bed. Let's go. Let's start right away. Why doesn't a veteran have the same access to care within the Department of Veterans Affairs? Why does a veteran have to go on a waiting list for up to a month? What's going to happen when a veteran hears that from their VA provider, like, oh, we can get you, well, we might get an assessment here in a week and they'll put you on a waiting list. That veteran really hears what he's hearing is we can't help you. And what happened to that guy? He's going to relapse. He's going to die. And we've got cases of that. There's even a case right now that happened last summer. Very similar story. He just heard I couldn't be helped. We found out about him. His name's Luis DeFoya. I can say his name because his family released in writing. He was a school teacher in Los Angeles, struggled with alcoholism, came to us through community care, did well. A couple months later, he relapsed. Common occurrence. It happens, right? It usually doesn't take one shot and you're cured. It just often doesn't work that way. He wanted to come back to us, right? He asked specifically. And West Los Angeles VA, as a policy issue, even though the boots on the ground folks wanted to help him, but as a policy issue, they said, well, we have to assess you and then we might be able to get you spotted at the domiciliary. He says, I don't want to go to the domiciliary because it's, he had some opinions about that, right? About what that place was and what they're about and what's happening there. And he knew his rights. He had some agency. He did his homework. He said, look, according to the Mission Act, I'm supposed to be able to get this. And he had to filed a grievance essentially with the Veteran Experience Office. Took 10 days for him to get back to him while this guy's still struggling. And then we caught wind of it. We reached out to, hey, Luis, we'll come on in. Scholarship. We don't care. We want to help you, right? It's too late. He was dead. His wife found him. He died. Yeah. So that's a really sad story. And guess what? That's one But there are hundreds of cases like that. So again, it's again, this is something that I really hope that folks at VA, and I hope Secretary Collins hears this, is that a veteran needs to have the same access to care of some sort, whether it's VA care or community care, that anybody off the street with the most basic insurance policy can have. A veteran does not have that today.
Yeah.
That's a real problem. And if we made those changes, if Secretary Collins could do this before lunch today and make these changes if he wanted to. I just don't know if he and people, VA Central Office, are fully aware of this problem. Is if he could change that today, within weeks, days, you'd be saving dozens of veterans' lives in California alone. And within weeks and months, you will save hundreds of lives. So that's something that I think is so important, doesn't get enough attention. And so that's something I think is really important.